In last week's episode of Live It, we learned a bit about the book of Galatians. With that context of the Galatian worldview, one that would have split time into two ages separated by the actions of Jesus, let's dig a little deeper and take a look at some of the prevailing prejudices amongst the Galatians and how we can easily fall prey to the same temptations that led them down the paths of sin that they found themselves on. We ended last week's episode with a brief look at Galatians 2, but we're going to take it a few steps further today as we look at a pretty heated interaction between Paul and Peter. Starting in verse 11, it says, "But when Cephas," that's Peter, "came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews?" See, Peter in Paul's eyes was actually doubly in the wrong. His behavior was out of line with the truth of the gospel, and by that same behavior, he was going back on his previous stance, a stance of love, grace, and acceptance. On arrival in Antioch, Peter had eaten with the Gentile Christians, sharing table fellowship with them, as he had done in the house of Cornelius in Acts 10 and 11. To understand why this mattered, why it was far more than just a mere matter of table manners, we remind ourselves why, in traditional Jewish thinking and practice, this type of table fellowship was frowned upon, and why for the early Christians it became not just optional, but mandatory. See, the Jews banned fellowship with Gentiles because Gentiles were in their mind idolaters. For Paul, the Jesus followers had to insist on shared meals because Jesus' death had broken the idol's power. The Jewish ban assumed that idolatry produced unclean lifestyles. The Jesus-based table fellowship celebrated the Spirit's cleansing and life-transforming power. The Jewish restriction assumed that Israel's law was still in force and that any relaxation would be flagrant disloyalty. Paul argued that the new age had dawned in which law's temporary restrictions were to be set aside. So looking specifically back at Peter's actions, it says that he drew back and separated himself. See, Paul attributes this to fear. He was afraid of the circumcision people, is what it says. We are living in a world today where fear and anxiety are pervasive emotions that we all wrestle with. We don't have to look very far to find a new ideology or concept that is being heralded as the end of the world and a threat to the gospel. A brief aside, there is no such thing as a threat to the gospel. There may be threats to our witness, or threats to understanding the gospel rightly, but the gospel cannot be threatened, cannot be silenced, and will not be triumphed over. I believe that more often than not, a few disgruntled people with the platform become agents of our enemy to drum up anxiety amongst the people of God around a few of our favorite smokescreens in order to distract us from our real responsibilities as believers in Christ. So looking back at Peter in verse 13, the situation really goes from bad to worse. Once the local Jewish Jesus followers saw Peter withdrawing from the table fellowship with Gentile believers, they drew their own conclusions and followed his example. A particularly tragic element in all of this is that their sham carried along even Barnabas. Even Barnabas, we feel the pain in that phrase. Barnabas was the one who had originally seen the grace of God at work in the multi-ethnic community of believers in Antioch. N.T. Wright speaks to this encounter saying, Peter, Barnabas, and the rest were in fact people of the crucified Messiah, but they were pretending to be people of Torah, of law, as though the crucified Messiah was just an addition to Jewish identity, not its radical transformation. See, truth was at stake. And now Paul publicly confronts Peter, as we looked at last week, and the others for not walking in the truth of the gospel. They turned away from the attitudes of love and gospel inclusivity that the blood of Christ had bought and instead walked down the path of ethnic and cultural exclusivity. They were more motivated by fear and status amongst those from Jerusalem than motivated by loving those different from them. I want to encourage you today with this. Do not let the fears and anxiety of this world allow you to be swayed. The gift of the Spirit and the freedom of the present age has made way for many to live within the will of Christ, but for people of all backgrounds to live in proximity with one another. This takes intentional sacrifice, intentional truth-telling, and intentional love. Today and every day, let's be people who embody those characteristics.